I'm Chris, and this is Bo, and happy May the 4th be with you. Uh, Welcome to another experiment. This one's a little special. When I was growing up, I was always into science fiction, like reading Jules Verne or H.G. Wells. And strangely, I attached myself to films early on. My mother was teaching. She always had a book of rental films for schools. So I'd thumb through them all the time and learned about so many films, of all types, but I was always interested in science fiction. And so this was probably, I don't know, early 70s or whatever. And there happened to be a film that came along that was a little more adult. Couldn't quite make anything out of it. It was a film by George Lucas called THX 1138. Now, THX 1138 was based on a film that George Lucas had done while he was in college. A small film that gained him a big reputation and the interest of Francis Ford Coppola, and who he would start the company Zoetrope with a little later on. And they remade the film starring Robert Duvall, Donald Pleasance, and it's a very dystopian film. I suggest you watch it. Most people don't get it, much like the original Blade Runner, or even the 2049 sequel. But this always caught my eye, and so I became very well aware of George Lucas's name, and then he did the film about his life growing up in California called American Graffiti. So at this time, he wanted to make a film about using Flash Gordon because he loved the original serials of yesteryear. And he decided, he found out that he couldn't get the rights to it. Dino De Laurentiis owned the film rights at the time. And so Francis Ford Coppola said, hey, why don't you write your own script? So he did, and that with the popularity of American Graffiti, which THX was a complete bomb, he was working at Universal for American Graffiti, and he had filmed it in about, I think, maybe less than 30 days. So immediately, and it was one of the first kind of blockbusters, if not mention all the retro soundtracks. And then it spawned a little kind of pilot for a very popular TV series with Ron Howard starring, called Happy Days, which was the spin-off, came from or kind of the proto-pilot was from a show that was called Love American Style. It was a bunch of, short little vignettes about love and in various times. And so, Lucas was all prepared to sell his movie called The Star Wars. And of course, Universal passed it up. How strange. Finally, with the help of an artist who became probably, next to H.R. Giger, a man named Ralph McQuarrie, who did all the production designs. And since there was a magazine that had just debuted called Starlog, and I read Starlog cover to cover, And on the second issue, which had Space 1999 on the cover, which I watched quite a bit because I was a fan of Gary Anderson's series and his prior series, UFO, which I recommend. There was this little blurb about the production of this movie called Star Wars, which they shortened the moniker. And it had all these just 2 production paintings, and I was just blown away by this guy's art. I don't think I had that kind of reaction maybe since maybe Dali or whatnot. So I read anything back then, and this is, prior to 1977, anything that I could about the production of it. And finally, the novelization came out, and my best friend, Sergio, gave me the book, in quotes, and I read it cover to cover, and the movie was debuting, and on May the 24th. Now, of course, this is Star Wars Day, and it's May the 4th. May the 4th be with you. Traditionally, Star Wars releases were always in May the 25th, in honor of the original release in 1977. Lucas had so many problems in getting extra money to finish the product, which was going to be a disaster. It was predicted. Much like the predicted disaster they had for Jaws by his friend Steven Spielberg a few years earlier. And both films were kind of saved by the composer John Williams, who was already familiar with because of his work on Lost in Space and other television series. And so my stepfather, Bob Allison, decided to take us. It was before a school night, and back then they used to have these things called sneak peeks. And you would go see the movie the night before release. Consequently, every Star Wars film that has come out, I've seen the night before since. So we saw it in Boston, and usually they're shown at midnight back then. And it was usually only one showing. And I had already known about the story, and Lucas wasn't allowed any more money. And the film was only released in a limited release. I forget how many cities. I don't even think it was 25. I'm sure I'm wrong on that number, but Boston was one of them. And they wouldn't allow any prints to be made of the film. So when you were making a film, there's a thing called a work print where you have the original cuts and slices and dices and edits back in the early Wild Wild West days of filmmaking. And sometimes these work prints would even have scenes that were cut out in the director's cut, and which is the theatrical release after it's locked down. And there was one scene that I would see in the only again in the 1997 re-release special editions of one scene of Luke seeing Biggs, and I was already familiar with Biggs. And there was a big scene that really introduces Luke Skywalker and Biggs and Luke's friends, and they all call him Wormy. And so it was interesting to see this scene, and then when I saw the film again, I didn't see the scene, so I often wondered why. It wasn't until later I found out about them not being able to use regular prints. So I saw this movie. I mean, films really changed my life. Walt Disney's Fantasia being probably one of them. Uh, um but this movie really hit me. I mean, made me want to do animation, acting, and pursue it more. I'd always worked on my own films when I was a little kid. I was always drawing. Um, and back then, I was really, just then I was into a big DC Comics thing. I wasn't I've never been a real big superhero fan, but I always, strangely, I liked Aquaman. So I read Aquaman, and then after that, it was Star Wars and Star Wars and Star Wars. And that film really changed my life. And at the same time, in 1977, punk rock was bubbling up, and didn't really get any sort of recognition until about 1979, because the radios really didn't want to play them. They were playing their newly found love for AOR music, basically classic rock, and trying to promote like middle of the road, sometimes a little harder bands. That's why you always hear the same hit song over and over 20 times or 20, 30 times a day, because of that kind of format after the sort of dissolving of the AM radio format from yesteryear, as probably seen in An American Graffiti, with great original disc jockeys such as Wolfman Jack, Arnie Wu Ginsberg, who recently passed away from here. So at the height of this was the same introduction for me of punk rock. I was still a little wary of it, but I fell in love with a spin-off band from that called Two-Way Army, which would feature Gary Newman, who would go on. He would change the name of the band, just like the Gary Newman Band, or just Gary Newman instead of Two-Way Army. He kept the same musicians that he had been playing with in Two-Way Army, and they were more science fiction oriented, but they were probably my first kind of introduction really to punk. So 1977 really set forth a benchmark. Also, there's a famous song, single off the Clash City Rock? No, White Riot single. A B-side, back when there were B-sides or singles, of the Clash's White Riot. And it's a song that always steps out just because of the title and the time. And I would dearly love the Clash. I don't know. And then later on, a little later on, I discovered this band from New York called the Misfits, and they had a song called "We Are 138." And I always kind of sort of tied that in with it, and hence why my love of George Lucas in general, but Star Wars and Glenn Danzig's writing music from the Misfits to Sam Hain to his solo band Danzig has always stuck. That's why I kind of named my band 138.